A man woke up startled by loud, persistent knocking at the door, but when he opened it, he froze. A wounded, wild, and terrified bobcat was standing there, staring at him like it was begging for help. But what this animal needed wasn't just physical aid. It was something much deeper and unbelievable. The cold Montana night wrapped around Ethan Miller's isolated cabin like a frozen shroud. Winter had come early to the foothills of the Bitterroot Mountains, and with it, the kind of silence that made a man aware of his own heartbeat. Ethan had grown accustomed to the solitude over the past 8 months since purchasing this remote property. It suited him, the distance from people, from expectations, from the life he'd left behind in Seattle. Sleep had just pulled him under when a sound jolted him awake. Not the familiar creak of wood contracting in the cold or the whisper of wind through pine needles. This was deliberate, rhythmic. Someone or something was knocking at his door. Ethan sat up, suddenly alert. 3 in the morning was no time for visitors, especially not 20 miles from the nearest town. The knocking continued, faint but persistent, as if whatever was out there knew exactly where to strike. "Who's there?" he called out, reaching for the baseball bat he kept beside his bed. No answer came, only more knocking, quieter now, almost weakening. Approaching the window, Ethan cautiously pulled back the curtain, expecting to see a lost hiker, or maybe a neighbor in need. What he saw instead froze him in place. Under the weak glow of the porch light stood a bobcat, its tawny coat smeared with dark patches, eyes reflecting the light with an eerie intensity. It was wounded, that much was clear, but what struck Ethan was its demeanor. No aggression, no frantic movements. Just a steady gaze fixed on his door, as if it had come here with purpose. "Jesus," Ethan whispered, letting the curtain fall back into place. His first instinct was to ignore it. Wild animals were unpredictable, dangerous, yet something about those eyes held a desperation that tugged at him. The animal hadn't tried to claw its way in, it was waiting, almost politely, for someone to acknowledge its presence. Against his better judgment, Ethan moved to the door. He'd spent enough time in these mountains to know bobcats rarely approached human dwellings unless starving or severely injured. This one clearly needed help, though why it had chosen his particular door remained a mystery. The knocking had stopped by the time he reached for the handle. For a moment he hesitated, wondering if the animal had given up and left. Then, drawing a deep breath, he cracked the door open just enough to peer through. The bobcat remained there, swaying slightly on its feet. Now that Ethan could see it properly, the extent of its injuries became apparent. A deep gash ran along its side, blood matting the fur. The animal's flanks heaved with labored breaths, but its eyes, amber and intelligent, stayed locked on. Ethan's. There was no fear in them, no wild panic, just a strange determination that seemed almost human. "You should have gone to a vet," Ethan muttered, opening the door wider. The bobcat didn't charge or retreat. It simply stood its ground, watching, waiting. Something about its behavior struck Ethan as oddly familiar, like encountering an old acquaintance whose name hovered just beyond recall. Ethan had never considered himself an animal person. Growing up in downtown Chicago hadn't offered many opportunities for wildlife encounters, and his adult life in tech hardly required understanding animal behavior. Yet here he was, contemplating how to help a wounded predator that had somehow selected his doorstep as a sanctuary. "Stay put," he said, knowing full well the absurdity of giving commands to a wild animal. To his surprise, the bobcat didn't move as he retreated inside to gather supplies. Basic first aid for humans would have to suffice. He had nothing specifically for treating animals. When he returned with towels, water, and his limited medical kit, the bobcat remained exactly where he'd left it, though its strength seemed to be fading rapidly. With extreme caution, Ethan knelt down, expecting the animal to recoil or swipe at him. Instead, it sank down onto the porch floor as if relieved that help had finally arrived. "This is going to hurt," Ethan warned softly as he dampened a cloth and reached toward the wound. The bobcat flinched slightly at his touch, but offered no resistance. As Ethan gently cleaned away the blood and dirt, he noticed something beneath the matted fur that stopped his hand mid-motion. A collar. Weathered and worn, but unmistakably a collar, nearly embedded in the fur as if it had been there for years. Wild bobcats didn't wear collars. This animal had, at some point, been in human care. "Who did you belong to?" Ethan murmured, carefully working to expose the tag that hung from the collar. The metal was scratched and tarnished, the engraving barely legible, but what he could make out sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the night air. The address, faded but discernible, was his own cabin. Ethan pulled back. Staring at the bobcat with new eyes, the animal returned his gaze steadily, almost as if it understood the significance of what he'd discovered. A dozen questions crowded Ethan's mind. How old was this collar? Who had lived here before him? And, most pressing, how had this animal found its way back after what must have been years? The previous owner of the cabin, according to the realtor, had been a wildlife researcher named James Thornton, who lived alone for nearly a decade before abruptly selling the property and moving to Alaska. The cabin had stood empty for almost 2 years before Ethan purchased it, drawn by its isolation and the promise of a simpler life after the burnout that had driven him from his tech career. "You belong to Thornton," Ethan said, more to himself than to the animal. "But that was years ago. How did you survive all this time?" The bobcat blinked slowly, its breathing slightly steadier now that the bleeding had slowed. For a fleeting moment, Ethan felt as if it had understood every word. With the wound cleaned and bandaged as best he could manage, Ethan faced a new dilemma. He couldn't leave an injured animal outside in the cold, but bringing a wild predator into his home seemed equally unwise. The bobcat made the decision for him, attempting to stand but stumbling weakly against his leg. "All right, just for tonight," Ethan found himself saying, "and only because you're hurt." He fashioned a makeshift stretcher from an old blanket, and with utmost care managed to lift the surprisingly heavy animal and carry it inside. He created a bed of towels in the corner of his living room, far from his own bedroom, and gently lowered the bobcat onto it. The animal curled up immediately, eyes half closed, but still tracking Ethan's movements. There was nothing threatening in its demeanor, just exhaustion and what Ethan could only describe as relief. That night, Ethan barely slept. Every few hours, he crept out to check on his unexpected guest, half expecting to find the living room destroyed or the bobcat gone. Instead, each time he found it sleeping peacefully, its rhythmic breathing the only sound in the quiet cabin. By morning, Ethan was on his computer, searching for everything he could find about bobcats in captivity, their lifespan in the wild, and most importantly, any information about the previous owner of his cabin. James Thornton had published several papers on wildlife rehabilitation, specializing in predator species native to Montana. One article, dated 7 years ago, contained a photo that made Ethan's breath catch. Thornton stood outside the very same cabin, and beside him, barely more than a kit, was a bobcat. The resemblance to the adult animal now sleeping in Ethan's living room was unmistakable. The same pattern of markings around the eyes, the distinctive notch in one ear. The caption confirmed what Ethan had begun to suspect. Researcher James Thornton with orphaned bobcat kit, which will be rehabilitated and released back into the wild. Further searching revealed a follow-up article, published a year later. Thornton had indeed rehabilitated the orphaned bobcat named Scout, but contrary to protocol, had formed an unusual bond with the animal. Scout had remained near the cabin even after release, becoming something of a local legend among the handful of scattered neighbors in the area. Then, 6 years ago, Thornton had received a job offer he couldn't refuse, leading a prestigious research program in Denali National Park. According to the article, Scout had disappeared shortly after Thornton's departure, presumably returning to a fully wild existence. Yet here was Scout, against all odds, returned to the only place that had ever been home. 6 years of wilderness survival, covering who knew how many miles, guided by some inexplicable internal compass that had led him back to a cabin whose owner was long gone. "You came looking for him," Ethan said softly, as he knelt beside the sleeping Bobcat the next morning. "But you found me instead." Scout's eyes blinked open at the sound of Ethan's voice. For a moment, there was confusion in them, then what seemed like resignation. The Bobcat made no attempt to rise, though the water and small pieces of chicken Ethan had left nearby remained untouched. "You need to eat," Ethan urged, pushing the plate closer. Scout regarded the offering with apparent suspicion. "It's not poisoned, I promise. Just grocery store chicken, nothing fancy." Whether it was hunger or a decision to trust, Scout finally stretched out a paw and dragged a piece of meat closer, consuming it with delicate precision. Ethan watched, fascinated by the Bobcat's careful table, manners. This was no ordinary wild animal. Years of human contact had left their mark. Over the next few days, a tentative routine developed. Scout remained in his corner, healing slowly but steadily. Ethan found himself talking to the Bobcat, constantly narrating his daily activities as if addressing a roommate rather than a wild animal. To his surprise, Scout seemed to listen, tracking him with those intelligent eyes, responding with subtle ear flicks and occasional soft sounds that weren't quite domesticated, but certainly not wholly wild. "I should call someone," Ethan told Scout on the third day, scrolling through contacts for wildlife rehabilitation centers. "You need proper care, maybe surgery? I'm just a software engineer with a first aid kit." Scout's ears flattened at these words, and he let out a low, rumbling sound that wasn't quite a growl, but certainly conveyed displeasure. "Don't like that idea, huh?" Ethan found himself laughing. "Can't say I blame you. They'd probably keep you caged up for weeks." As if understanding perfectly, Scout's ears returned to their normal position. Ethan shook his head, wondering if the isolation was finally getting to him, making him imagine communication where there was only animal behavior. Yet as the days passed and Scout grew stronger, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary was happening between them. The Bobcat followed him from room to room now, still cautious but increasingly comfortable. At night, Scout had abandoned the towel bed in favor of a spot at the foot of Ethan's bed, maintaining a respectful distance but clearly preferring human company. One evening, as snow began to fall outside, blanketing the forest in white silence, Ethan found himself digging through storage boxes he hadn't yet unpacked since moving in. The previous owner had left behind various items deemed too insignificant or bulky to transport to Alaska, old research equipment, field journals, and several photo albums that the realtor had included with the property. "Let's see if we can find more about your history," Ethan told Scout, who watched from a dignified distance as he pulled out an album with a weathered leather cover. Inside were photographs documenting Thornton's years at the cabin, and as Ethan had hoped, many featured Scout. There was Scout as a tiny kit, barely larger than Thornton's hands. Scout learning to hunt with awkward pounces at toys. Scout growing into adolescence, already showing the distinctive markings that Ethan now recognized instantly. The final photos showed an adult Bobcat, still wearing the collar, lounging on the very same porch where Ethan had found him wounded. "You were practically raised here," Ethan murmured, flipping through the pages. Scout had crept closer now, head tilted as if recognizing the images. When Ethan reached a photo of Thornton sitting in an armchair with Scout sprawled across his lap, a position that would terrify most people, the Bobcat made a soft chirping sound. "You miss him," Ethan realized, studying the Bobcat's expression. There was something undeniably wistful in those amber eyes. "All this time, you've been looking for him." The implications of this realization weighed on Ethan. Scout had traversed wilderness and danger, somehow navigating back to this specific cabin after years away, only to find a stranger in place of the human he'd bonded with. The disappointment must have been profound, yet the Bobcat had stayed, accepted Ethan's help, and now seemed to be forming a new connection. As if reading his thoughts, Scout moved closer and cautiously settled beside Ethan on the floor, not touching but near enough for Ethan to feel the animal's warmth. "I'm not him," Ethan said softly, "but I'm here now." That night marked a turning point. Scout began accompanying Ethan outside, not venturing far but clearly enjoying the freedom to explore the familiar territory around the cabin. The wound, on his side, was healing well, his strength returning visibly each day. Soon, Ethan knew, the Bobcat would be fully recovered and faced with a choice: return to the wild or remain in this strange, in-between existence. The thought of Scout leaving created an unexpected hollow feeling in Ethan's chest. He'd come to Montana seeking solitude, convinced that isolation was the answer to the burnout and emptiness that had plagued him in Seattle. Yet this unlikely companionship had shifted something fundamental within him. "I came here to be alone," he confessed to Scout as they sat on the porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the snow-covered mountains in shades of gold and pink. "Thought I was tired of connections, responsibilities. Turns out I was just tired of the wrong ones." Scout blinked slowly, a gesture Ethan had come to recognize as contentment. The Bobcat had regained much of his magnificent wild appearance, the sleek coat now clean and thick, the eyes bright and alert. Only the collar, which Ethan had carefully cleaned and loosened, remained as evidence of his unusual past. 2 weeks after Scout's arrival, as Ethan was checking through his dwindling supplies and planning a trip into town, his satellite phone rang. Few people had this number: his parents, his former business partner, and the realtor who'd sold him the property. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar Alaskan number. "Hello?" Ethan answered cautiously. "Is this Ethan Miller?" A deep voice responded. "The new owner of the Bitterroot cabin?" "Yes, that's me. Who's asking?" There was a pause, and then, "This is James Thornton. I used to own your place. I'm sorry to call out of the blue like this, but something unusual has happened, and I thought you should know." Ethan's gaze immediately went to Scout, who had perked up at the sound of the voice coming through the speaker, ears forward with intense interest. "Actually, Mr. Thornton," Ethan said slowly, "I think I might know why you're calling." "You do?" Surprise colored Thornton's voice. "So you've seen him. Scout's actually there. He showed up at my door about 2 weeks ago, pretty badly injured, but he's recovering well." There was a sound on the other end of the line that might have been a suppressed emotion. When Thornton spoke again, his voice was tight with control. "I didn't think. It's been 6 years. I never imagined he'd find his way back." "How did you know to call?" Ethan asked, watching as Scout moved closer to the phone, sniffing the air as if trying to catch a scent from the voice. "I didn't, not for certain," Thornton admitted. "But 3 nights ago, I had this dream, so vivid it woke me up. I saw Scout wounded at the old cabin door, your door now, I suppose. It was so real that I couldn't shake it. I know it sounds ridiculous." "It doesn't," Ethan interrupted. "Not at all. Would you? Would you like to talk to him?" Another pause, longer this time. "You can put him on the phone." "I can try. He seems to recognize your voice already." Ethan held the phone towards Scout, who approached cautiously, whiskers twitching. "Go ahead," Ethan encouraged Thornton. "Say something to him." "Scout?" Thornton's voice came through the speaker, tentative at first, then gaining strength. "Hey, buddy, it's me. It's James." The reaction was immediate and astonishing. Scout's entire demeanor transformed. He made a sound Ethan had never heard before, a mixture of chirps and purrs that seemed to bubble up from some deep well of emotion. The Bobcat pressed his nose against the phone, pause, reaching up as if trying to touch the source of the beloved voice. "He remembers you," Ethan said when he put the phone back to his ear, his own voice unexpectedly thick. "There's no doubt about it." "I never should have left him," Thornton said quietly. "The researchers here told me bobcats can't form lasting bonds like domesticated animals, that he'd revert to wild instincts within weeks. I believed them because it was easier than admitting I was abandoning a friend." Ethan watched as Scout paced now, agitated, clearly searching for the person whose voice had briefly filled the room. "What happens now?" he asked, realizing he dreaded the answer. "I'm coming back," Thornton said without hesitation. "Not permanently. My work here is important. But I need to see him to make sure he's okay, and to thank you in person for taking care of him when I couldn't." After arranging the details of Thornton's visit, scheduled for the following week, Ethan hung up and turned to Scout, who was still visibly processing the familiar voice he'd heard. "Your old friend is coming," Ethan told him, reaching out to gently stroke the bobcat's head, a liberty Scout had only recently begun to permit. "You'll get to see him again." Scout leaned into the touch, but his eyes remained focused on the now silent phone, as if expecting more. Watching him, Ethan was struck by a sudden, uncomfortable realization. When Thornton arrived, would Scout choose to leave with him? Could Ethan lose this unexpected companion as quickly as he'd gained him? The week leading up to Thornton's visit passed in strange tension. Scout seemed more alert, more expectant, often watching the door or perking up at distant sounds. Ethan found himself simultaneously looking forward to meeting the man who had formed such a profound bond with a wild animal, and dreading the changes his arrival might bring. On the morning Thornton was due to arrive, Ethan stood on the porch, Scout beside him, both of them watching the narrow dirt road that wound through the trees toward the cabin. The sound of an approaching vehicle broke the forest quiet, and Scout's entire body tensed, ears forward, tail twitching with anticipation. A weathered jeep emerged from the tree line, crawling along the uneven road until it finally pulled up in front of the cabin. For a moment after the engine died, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened and a tall, bearded man stepped out, his eyes immediately finding Scout. "My God," James Thornton breathed, standing perfectly still. "It's really you." Scout's reaction was electric. With a sound that was half chirp, half cry, the bobcat bounded down the porch steps and across the clearing. Ethan tensed, worried about the healing wound, but Scout moved with fluid grace, showing no sign of pain. Thornton knelt as the bobcat approached, and to Ethan's amazement, Scout launched himself into the man's arms. The reunion was unlike anything Ethan had ever witnessed. Thornton buried his face in Scout's fur, murmuring words too low to hear, while the bobcat vibrated with purrs loud enough to carry across the clearing. They remained locked in the embrace for a long moment, two beings reconnected across years and distance, until finally Thornton looked up, his weathered face streaked with tears. "Thank you," he said simply, rising to his feet as Scout circled him excitedly. "I'm James Thornton, and you must be Ethan Miller." "That's me," Ethan confirmed, descending the steps to shake the older man's hand. "It's good to meet you. Scout's been quite an experience." Thornton laughed, a warm, genuine sound. "I can imagine. Not exactly what you signed up for when you bought a secluded cabin, I'm guessing." Inside, over coffee, Thornton shared Scout's story in full. He'd found the bobcat kit beside its mother, who'd been struck by a car on the highway 20 miles away. Against protocol, he'd brought the orphaned kit home, rather than to a wildlife center. "I told myself it was temporary," Thornton explained, absently stroking Scout, who had settled possessively against his side on the couch. "Just until I could find a proper rehabilitation facility. But days turned to weeks, and Scout, he just became part of my life." Scout had thrived under Thornton's care, learning to hunt but always returning to the cabin for companionship. Their bond deepened over 5 years until the unexpected job offer from Alaska threatened to disrupt everything. "They wouldn't let me bring him," Thornton said, his voice tight with old regret. "Too many regulations, too much red tape." And the experts all said the same thing. He'd be better off returning to the wild completely. That my presence was holding him back from his true nature. So Thornton had left, convinced he was doing what was best for Scout, though the separation had haunted him ever since. I always wondered what happened to him. Whether he survived, whether he forgot me. I guess I have my answer now. Ethan recounted finding Scout at his door, wounded and determined. "The collar was what got me," he admitted. "I couldn't understand how a wild bobcat would be wearing a collar, especially one with this address. I put that on him when he was young, mostly just to track him when he started venturing further from the cabin," Thornton explained, examining the weathered band with evident emotion. "It's a miracle it's still intact after all this time." As the day progressed, Ethan observed the deep connection between man and animal with mingled awe and a surprising touch of envy. Scout was transformed in Thornton's presence, more animated, more expressive, constantly seeking contact as if to reassure himself that his long-lost friend was truly there. That evening, as they prepared dinner together, the inevitable question finally surfaced. "So," Ethan began carefully, "what happens now? With Scout, I mean." Thornton's hands stilled over the vegetables he was chopping. Scout, who had been watching them from his perch on a nearby chair, went equally still, as if understanding the significance of the question. "I've been thinking about that since your call," Thornton admitted. "My first instinct was to take him back with me, somehow make it work, despite the regulations. But..." He glanced at Scout, then back to Ethan, his expression conflicted. "He's built a life here, with you, and I can't uproot him again. Not after everything he's been through to find his way back." He hesitated, then added softly, "Unless, of course, you don't want the responsibility. I'd understand completely." The question caught Ethan off guard. He'd been preparing himself for Scout's departure, steeling himself against the inevitable emptiness that would follow. The possibility that Scout might stay hadn't fully registered until this moment. "I want him to stay," Ethan said, the certainty of it surprising him. "These past weeks with him, they've changed something in me, but it should be his choice, shouldn't it? He came looking for you after all." Thornton smiled, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "Animals don't make choices the way we do. They follow. Instinct, attachment, the patterns that feel right to them. Scout came here looking for something familiar in a world that had changed around him. He found it in this place, and now in you." That night, by unspoken agreement, they all shared the main living space of the cabin. Thornton slept on the couch, Scout curled beside him, while Ethan retreated to his bedroom, giving them space for their reunion. But when he woke in the pre-dawn hours, he found Scout had migrated to the foot of his bed, maintaining his now customary sleeping position. The gesture seemed significant, though Ethan was careful not to read too much into it. Still, when he emerged from his room and found Thornton already awake, gazing thoughtfully out the window at the mountains, he felt compelled to mention it. "He came to sleep by me, sometime during the night," Ethan said, pouring coffee for them. "Both." Thornton nodded, unsurprised. "He's created a new pattern that includes you. That's not something a purely wild animal would do." He accepted the mug with a grateful nod. "There's something I need to show you, something I brought from Alaska. It might help explain." From his bag, Thornton withdrew a weathered journal and handed it to Ethan. "My research notes on Scout from the very beginning. I documented everything, his behaviors, his development, the way he navigated between wild instincts and human connection." Ethan opened the journal carefully, finding pages of meticulous observations, sketches and photographs detailing Scout's growth from tiny kit to mature bobcat. But what caught his attention were the later entries, the ones where Thornton's scientific objectivity gave way to something more personal. "I've come to believe," one passage read, "that what we call wild and tame are not binary states, but points on a continuum. Scout exists in the liminal space between neither fully wild nor domesticated, but something altogether unique. He chooses daily whether to return or to stay away, and in that choice lies a kind of freedom neither realm alone can offer." "You understood him better than the other experts," Ethan observed, looking up from the journal to where Scout had appeared, stretching languidly as he entered the room. "I observed without preconceptions," Thornton corrected. "Most wildlife biologists approach animals with rigid categories already in mind. Wild or tame, predator or prey, instinct or learning. But the reality is messier, more interesting." He reached down to scratch Scout's ears as the bobcat rubbed against his leg. "Scout taught me that." As the morning sun climbed higher, painting the cabin in warm light, Thornton shared his proposal. "I can't stay beyond the weekend. My research team needs me back, but I'd like to visit. Maybe a few times a year, if that's all right with you." "Of course," Ethan agreed immediately. "You're always welcome here, both of you." He glanced meaningfully at Scout, who was now dividing his attention between them, moving from one to the other, as if unwilling to choose. "And in return," Thornton continued, "I'd like you to continue what I started, observing Scout, documenting his behaviors, especially his choice to maintain human connection despite his wild nature. It could be valuable research, something we could publish together eventually." The offer took Ethan by surprise. "I'm not a biologist. I wouldn't know where to begin." "Neither was I, not really," Thornton confessed. "I was an ecologist who stumbled into behavioral research because one stubborn bobcat kid decided to adopt me." He smiled at the memory. "I can guide you through the basics. The rest is just paying attention, being present, respecting Scout's autonomy while offering companionship." Something about the proposition resonated with Ethan in unexpected ways. His flight from Seattle had been partly about escaping the endless grind of technology and algorithms, the growing sense that he was losing touch with something essential about life. Here was an opportunity to redirect his analytical mind toward something organic, unpredictable, alive in ways code could never be. "I'd like that," he said finally. "I think it might be good for both of us." The rest of Thornton's visit passed in a blend of practical instruction and shared stories. Thornton showed Ethan how to check Scout for injuries, how to recognize signs of illness, and what behaviors might indicate distress. They hiked the surrounding forest together, Thornton pointing out Scout's likely hunting grounds and the territorial markers the bobcat had maintained even during his human associations. On the final evening before Thornton's departure, they sat on the porch, watching Scout patrol the perimeter of the clearing, his movements fluid and purposeful, quintessentially wild, yet periodically interrupted by returns to the porch for brief moments of contact. "I've been meaning to ask," Ethan said as twilight deepened around them. "That call you made to me, you said you had a dream about Scout being injured at my door. Do you usually have such specific dreams?" Thornton was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the bobcat's shadowy form moving through the gathering darkness. "No," he admitted finally, "never anything like that before. I almost didn't call because it seemed so irrational, but the dream was so vivid, so urgent, that I couldn't shake it." "How do you explain it?" Ethan pressed, genuinely curious. Thornton shrugged, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Science has limits, Ethan. It's a powerful tool for understanding the world, but it doesn't capture everything. Sometimes connections exist that we don't have instruments to measure or vocabulary to describe." Scout emerged from the shadows then, padding silently up the steps to settle between them, his presence somehow underlining Thornton's words. Ethan reached out to stroke the bobcat's flank, marveling at how quickly this wild creature had become integral to his sense of home. "Whatever brought him back," Thornton continued, "and whatever led me to call you, I'm grateful for it. Knowing he's alive, that he remembers, that he's found a new place to belong, it heals something I've carried since leaving." The morning of Thornton's departure brought a crystalline Montana day, the sky an impossible blue above snow-capped peaks. Scout seemed to sense the impending separation, staying closer than usual to Thornton as he packed his bags and prepared for the long drive back to the airport. "I left once without saying goodbye properly," Thornton said as he knelt before Scout at the final moment. "I won't make that mistake again." He cupped the bobcat's face in his hands, bringing their foreheads together in a gesture of such intimate communication that Ethan felt compelled to look away, giving them privacy for their farewell. When Thornton finally straightened, his eyes were damp, but his expression peaceful. "Take care of each other," he said to Ethan, extending his hand. Ethan took it, then, on impulse, pulled the older man into a brief hug. "We will, and we'll see you soon." They stood together on the porch, Ethan with his hand resting lightly on Scout's back, as Thornton's jeep disappeared down the winding road. When the sound of the engine had faded completely, Scout turned to Ethan, his amber eyes somehow questioning. "It's just us now, buddy," Ethan told him softly, "but he'll be back, and in the meantime, we've got work to do." In the weeks that followed, Ethan embraced his new role as Scout's companion and chronicler with unexpected enthusiasm. Following Thornton's guidance, he began keeping detailed records of Scout's behaviors, movements, and interactions. What had started as an obligation to Thornton quickly evolved into a genuine fascination with the complex being sharing his home. Scout continued to surprise him daily. The bobcat maintained a careful balance between his wild nature and his connection to Ethan, disappearing into the forest for hours at a time to hunt or explore, but always returning to the cabin before nightfall. He brought occasional gifts, usually small game, which he would deposit on the porch with what Ethan swore was pride. As winter deepened, blanketing the landscape in snow and ice, their routine adjusted accordingly. Scout spent more time inside, content to lounge near the fire during the coldest days. Ethan found himself talking to the bobcat constantly, narrating his thoughts, asking questions, and occasionally imagining responses. "I think I'm starting to understand why people become wildlife researchers," he told Scout one evening as they shared the warmth of the fireplace. "There's something addictive about observing another being so closely, recognizing patterns, witnessing decisions being made that have nothing to do with human logic." Scout blinked slowly in response, and Ethan laughed at himself. "Listen to me, philosophizing to a bobcat. If my colleagues from Seattle could see me now." But as the months passed and winter gave way to spring, Ethan realized he thought about his former life less and less. The pressures of deadlines, investor meetings, and technological advances that had once consumed his every waking hour now seemed distant and inconsequential compared to the rhythms of life in the Montana wilderness. His communications with Thornton grew more frequent, evolving from brief updates on Scout's health to lengthy exchanges about animal behavior, conservation issues, and increasingly collaborative research ideas. What had begun as a courtesy had developed into a genuine friendship and intellectual partnership, bridging the geographical distance between Montana and Alaska. "Your observations about Scout's territorial patterns are fascinating," Thornton wrote in one email. "The way he maintains wild behaviors while incorporating the cabin as a central point in his territory isn't something the literature has documented well in. Bobcats, we might be onto something significant here." Ethan's excitement about their findings was tempered only by a nagging concern that had grown as spring advanced. Scout was venturing further from the cabin, sometimes disappearing for a full day before returning. While Ethan knew this was natural behavior, particularly during mating season, He couldn't help worrying that each departure might be permanent. "You don't have to come back every night. You know," he told Scout one evening after the Bobcat had returned from a particularly long absence, "you're not a house cat. You don't owe me anything." Scout tilted his head regarding Ethan with that penetrating gaze that always seemed to see more than Ethan intended to reveal. Then, deliberately, the Bobcat crossed the room and settled against Ethan's leg, the contact brief but unmistakably intentional. The gesture nearly undid him. In the corporate world, Ethan had prided himself on emotional control, on logical decision-making unclouded by sentiment. Yet here he was, moved to the verge of tears by a wild animal's choice to maintain proximity. "I don't understand what's happening to me," he confessed to Catherine Reynolds, his nearest neighbor at 5 miles distant, when she stopped by with supplies during a particularly heavy spring rain. Catherine, a retired park ranger in her 60s, had become something of a mentor since learning about Scout, sharing her extensive knowledge of local wildlife and checking in on Ethan more frequently than was strictly neighborly. "What's happening?" Catherine said, cradling a mug of tea as Scout watched her warily from his perch near the window. "Is that you're reconnecting with something essential that most people in modern society have lost." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "That sounds suspiciously like New Age philosophy." Catherine's laugh was rich and knowing. "Nothing New Age about it. Humans evolved alongside wild creatures for hundreds of thousands of years. It's only in the blink of an evolutionary eye that we've separated ourselves so completely from them. What you're experiencing with Scout isn't mystical. It's deeply, fundamentally human." As spring blossomed into summer, Ethan's life fell into patterns dictated by natural rhythms rather than digital calendars. He rose with the sun, worked on coding projects during the hottest part of the day when Scout typically rested, and spent evenings observing the Bobcat's activities around the cabin. His journal entries, initially focused solely on Scout, expanded to include observations about other wildlife, weather patterns, and his own shifting relationship with the landscape. One blazing July afternoon, as Ethan sat on the porch transcribing notes from his journal into Thornton's research database, movement at the forest edge caught his attention. Scout had been gone since dawn, but this wasn't his usual approach. Something in the underbrush was moving tentatively, stopping and starting, as if uncertain. Ethan set aside his laptop, watching intently as the movement drew closer. Finally, Scout emerged from the tree line, but he wasn't alone. Following a few paces behind him, cautious but clearly deliberate in their movements, were 2 Bobcat kits, their spotted coats blending with the dappled forest shadows. "My God," Ethan breathed, freezing in place. Scout paused, looking back at the kits, then continued toward the cabin with what Ethan could only describe as purposeful intent. The kits followed, maintaining their distance but clearly taking cues from the adult Bobcat's confidence. Scout ascended the porch steps with his usual fluid grace, approaching Ethan as if this were any other day. The kits remained at the forest edge, watching with wide, wary eyes. Only when Scout returned to the yard and settled calmly in a patch of sunlight did they inch forward, their movements synchronized in that uncanny way of siblings. Ethan remained, motionless, scarcely daring to breathe as he witnessed what he knew instinctively was an extraordinary moment. Scout was introducing his offspring to the human place, to the human connection that had remained part of his existence despite his return to wild behaviors. "Hello there," he whispered to the kits, who froze at the sound of his voice, ears swiveling forward. Scout made a soft, chirping sound, almost identical to the one he'd made upon hearing Thornton's voice on the phone months ago. The kits relaxed slightly, but made no move to approach closer. For hours, this tableau held, Scout lounging casually, In the yard, the kits gradually expanding their explorations while maintaining a safe distance from Ethan and Ethan himself, transfixed by the privilege of witnessing this family dynamic. Only when twilight began to fall did Scout rise, stretch, and lead the kits back toward the forest. At the tree line, he paused, looking back at Ethan with what seemed like reassurance before disappearing into the growing darkness. That night, Ethan's call to Thornton was breathless with excitement. "You won't believe what happened today," he began, describing the appearance of the kits in meticulous detail. "That's extraordinary," Thornton agreed when Ethan had finished. "Female bobcats are notoriously protective of their young. For Scout to bring them so close to human presence and for the mother to permit it, that suggests he's maintained his status in the wild community while retaining his trust in you." "But what does it mean?" Ethan pressed. "Why would he bring them here?" Thornton was quiet for a moment. "In the simplest terms, he's sharing his family with you, the same way you might introduce a new friend to your parents or siblings. He's including you in his expanded social circle." The notion was staggering. A wild predator consciously choosing to initiate a cross-species social connection that extended beyond immediate survival needs. It challenged everything conventional science taught about wildlife behavior, about the boundaries between wild and tame. Over the following weeks, Scout's visits with the kits became more frequent, though the mother never appeared. The kits grew gradually bolder, venturing closer to the cabin, while Scout watched with what Ethan swore was pride. By August, they would come within a few yards of the porch, though they maintained a wariness that Scout himself had long since abandoned. "They're integrating the human element into their understanding of the world," Catherine observed during one of her visits, watching the kits from a respectful distance. Not as a threat, not as prey, but as something else entirely. Something to be cautious around but not feared. That's Scout's gift to them, a more nuanced worldview than most wild creatures ever develop. As summer waned and the first hints of autumn touched the Montana forests, Ethan faced an unexpected dilemma. His sabbatical from the tech world, initially planned for just 1 year, was nearing its end. His former business partner had been calling with increasing frequency, speaking of new projects, investor interest, opportunities too good to pass up. "The company needs you, Ethan," Marcus insisted during their latest call. "I've given you space, let you have this wilderness therapy or whatever it is, but it's time to come back to reality." Reality. The word stuck with Ethan long after he'd ended the call, with non-committal promises to think about it. What was more real? The artificial urgency of technology development, or the ancient rhythms of forest life he'd come to cherish? The digital connections he'd once valued, or the profound communication he'd developed with a being who didn't share his language? The answer came to him unexpectedly on a crisp September morning when Scout appeared at the cabin after a 3-day absence. The Bobcat wasn't alone. The kits accompanied him as usual, but this time, hanging back in the tree line, was their mother. She was smaller than Scout, but powerfully built, her eyes tracking Ethan's every movement with intense vigilance. Scout approached the porch as always, but there was something different in his demeanor, a tension, an expectancy. He looked back at the female, then to Ethan, then back again, his tail twitching with what Ethan had learned to recognize as anticipation. "You're introducing us," Ethan realized aloud, sinking slowly to a seated position on the porch steps, to appear less threatening. "You want us to meet?" For nearly an hour, this silent standoff continued. The female never approached closer than the forest edge, but neither did she retreat or call her kits away from Scout's vicinity. It was, Ethan understood, a profound concession from a wild mother, allowing her offspring near a human dwelling under the apparent assurance of their father that no harm would come to them. That evening, as Scout prepared to depart with his family, Ethan experienced a moment of perfect clarity. The bobcat paused at the forest edge, looking back at the cabin where Ethan stood watching. Their eyes met across the clearing, a moment of communication that transcended species boundaries. "Go on," Ethan said softly. "They need you more than I do." Scout held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned and disappeared into the gathering darkness, following his wild family home. When Scout didn't return the next day or the next, Ethan felt a hollowness he hadn't anticipated. He'd always known Scout was free to leave permanently, had even encouraged it in theory. But the reality of his absence left the cabin feeling emptier than it had before the bobcat's arrival. 2 days stretched into a week, then 2. Ethan continued his observations of the forest, his journal entries now wistful records of other wildlife. Deer moving through the clearing at dawn, ravens calling from the tall pines, even a black bear foraging for berries one misty morning. But no sign of Scout or his family. "I think he's gone for good," Ethan told Thornton during their weekly call. "And it's right, it's natural. He has a family to protect, to teach. They need him in ways I never could." "Perhaps," Thornton agreed, his voice gentle. "But Scout has always defied expectations. Don't write the final chapter yet." On the last night of September, as Ethan sat on the porch watching stars emerge above the mountains, movement at the forest edge caught his attention. A familiar silhouette emerged from the shadows, padding silently across the moonlit clearing. Scout approached the porch with his usual confident grace, showing no sign that his 2-week absence had changed anything between them. He settled beside Ethan on the step, close enough that their shoulders touched, and gazed up at the star-filled sky as if sharing in Ethan's contemplation. In that moment, Ethan understood what Thornton had meant about Scout-defying categories. The bobcat had made his choice, not between wild and tame, not between human and animal connections, but to embrace both. To move between worlds, creating a unique existence defined not by human expectations or animal instincts alone, but by his own internal compass. The following morning, Ethan called Marcus with his decision. "I'm not coming back," he said simply. "At least not in the way you're thinking. I'm willing to consult remotely, maybe develop specific projects. But my life is here now." "With a bobcat," Marcus said flatly, disbelief evident in his tone. "You're choosing to throw away everything we built for a wild animal that could disappear tomorrow." "No," Ethan corrected him gently. "I'm choosing a different kind of connection, a different way of understanding the world." He glanced out the window to where Scout was grooming himself in a patch of autumn sunlight. And yes, he could disappear tomorrow, or in a year, or in 10. That's his choice. And respecting it is part of ours. That winter, as snow once again blanketed the Montana landscape, Ethan and Scout settled into new patterns. The bobcat divided his time between his wild family and the cabin, sometimes disappearing for days but always returning, sometimes bringing one or both kits to the edge of the clearing for distant observation. Thornton visited twice, each time marveling at the evolution of Scout's behavior and the growing body of research their observations were producing. "What we're documenting here challenges fundamental assumptions about wildlife behavior," he told Ethan during his Christmas visit. "The capacity for individual choice, for maintaining connections across boundaries most biologists consider impermeable." "It's not just about Scout anymore," Ethan agreed, watching as the bobcat dozed before the fire, the picture of contentment. "It's about recognizing that the lines we draw between species, between wild and tame, might be more permeable than we ever realized." On a crystal-clear morning in early spring, almost exactly a year after Scout had first appeared wounded at his door, Ethan sat on the porch with his morning coffee, watching the bobcat patrol the perimeter of the clearing. Scout moved with purpose, marking territory, communicating his presence to other forest dwellers through scent and scratches on trees. As Ethan observed, he realized that the journal entry he'd write today would mark the completion of a full, annual cycle of observations. What had begun as a desperate animal seeking help had evolved into something science had no adequate language to describe, not pet, not research subject, but something closer to neighbor, to friend, to family of choice. Scout completed his circuit and bounded up the porch steps, settling beside Ethan with casual familiarity. Together, they watched as the morning sun illuminated the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley below. No words were needed. Their shared silence was communication enough. Some connections, Ethan reflected, are strong enough to bridge not just distance and time, but the ancient divisions between species. In finding Scout, he had found himself as well, a version of himself capable of patience, of wonder, of a quieter kind of purpose than he'd ever known in his former life. Bobcat tilted his head, amber eyes meeting Ethan's with that familiar intensity. Then, with a soft chirp that seemed to say everything needed, Scout leaned against him briefly before rising and trotting down the steps toward the forest. At the tree line, he paused, looking back once as if to say, "I'll return," before disappearing into the wilderness that was as much his home as the cabin had become. Ethan watched him go, feeling neither loss nor worry, only gratitude for the privilege of witnessing a life lived on its own terms, and for the unexpected gift of being included in it. Dear listeners, we hope that Ethan and Scout's extraordinary connection has touched your heart as deeply as it has touched ours. Some bonds transcend what we believe possible, reminding us that the natural world holds wisdom and wonder we're only beginning to understand. For more captivating stories that explore the remarkable connections between humans and the wild creatures we share this planet with, click on the playlist to your left. If this tale of trust and mutual respect across species boundaries moved you, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique narratives that explore life's complexity and beauty in unexpected ways. What unusual connections have you witnessed between people and wild animals? We'd love to hear your stories in the comments below.